Good evening, everyone. My name is Rahul Verma. I work at the Center for Policy Research. Thank you again for joining us. And today's conversation is going to be on exit polls, since Maharashtra and Jharkhand has been also announced, and they would be polling in November. The counting is on, I think, November 23rd. And I saw a meme going around on Twitter about exit polls where, that most exit polls should actually predict don't know, can't say, given what happened in during the Lok Sabha elections and then recently in Haryana and Jammu and Kashmir. So I'm going to just like take a couple of minutes to frame the conversation, and then I'll invite my panelists to reflect on what could be done about exit polls. So the first point that I want to make is, since we decided to do this panel discussion, after that, I got a couple of messages, whether this conversation is to defend exit polls or to berate them and attack them. And I want to say neither of those. The reason is that I see myself as a consumer of polling data. I teach polling data and voting behavior. And so this panel discussion in some ways comes out of concern for what's happening to polls. And I thought of my panelists in the same way because each one of them consume polling data in very different ways. And so this is not to take side, berate them, defend them, but to understand what's going on and especially what could be done so that we are not so off the mark in predictions. But more than predictions, I think what worries us that we use this polling data to understand Indian society, voting behavior, Indian democracy. And if some of those estimates are completely off the mark, then our understanding about our country is off the mark. So I think it comes from a concern. Second point, some of these, so also there, like in last couple of months, we have seen attacks on pollsters, they're being called names, and they're being, like labeled as having sort of like relations with stock market investors and those kind of things. I don't know how much of those things are true, and I don't want even to get into that debate. But something which is very important that some of these pollsters had pretty decent track record in last 7, 8 years. And when I mean a decent track record, I'm not saying that they were getting seat projections every time right. I don't expect them to get seat projections every time right. But they were fairly okay, at least in giving us the direction of elections, where in which direction the election is heading. And in some ways, most of the exit polls, or at least some of the credible exit polls, were giving us a very close estimate of vote shares. What seems to be happening now that even vote shares are way off the mark. So now the defense of exit polls can't be that, in India is a first past post the system. There are vagaries of the system. It's difficult to translate votes into seats. I think we are at a much deeper problem where vote estimates are completely off the mark. And sometimes we are getting the direction of the results completely wrong. The third point that I want to make is if you ask me why are they getting it wrong, my short answer would be I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because we can only speculate at this moment of time in absence of raw data why they are getting wrong. And even if we get raw data, we might still be not be able to fully sort of like pin down the reasons for why any poll at any point of time got it wrong. We need much more information to be able to figure out what's happening. And the reason why it's a difficult sort of like thing to figure out, because the usual explanations, which at least some of this, my panelists are going to reflect in a much deeper way. Generally, the usual explanations used to be that, if you have a low sample size, or if the samples are not representative, if you're not doing a seat by seat survey, it will be difficult to make election forecast in India. I think at least the reputed polling agencies, and by reputed, I mean that some of these polling agencies have been there for 10 to 15 years. So I'm not counting, those polling agencies which come every new polling agencies which come every election cycle, but some which have been there for 10, 15 years, have been doing surveys for a very, very long period of time, and they have a good track record of one. Saying something about the method of data collection, what their sample size was, how representative these surveys were or not were. So those usual explanations don't work. And even sort of like the conspiracy theories of them being in cahoots with party A or B, if they got Lok Sabha elections wrong, where they were predicting BJP, they got Chhattisgarh and Haryana wrong, where they were predicting sort of like Congress. What is different now, and after this I'll get my panelists, is earlier also polling agencies used to get elections wrong. But among 3, 4 polling agencies, and there are 2, 3 elections happening, someone would get something right, someone would get something wrong. And overall, we used to, okay. But what seems to be happening now that everyone is getting wrong, which makes this a very, very difficult moment to sort of understand what's happening. So let me first thank my panelist, Neelanjan Sarkar, my friend and colleague. He's associate professor at Ahmedabad University. Thank you, Neelanjan, for joining. Neelanjan has been working with polling data a lot. He writes on voting behavior a lot. And when he was here at CPR, Neelan and I used to do election things together. So I don't need to say much about his work. You all know him. Thank you, Neelan, for joining. Rukmini Srinivasan, she's founder and director of Data for India. So for those who haven't got a chance to look at this website, please do. Rukmini has been doing some fabulous stuff and trying to tell us about not just data, but through data, telling us stories about India in a format which is accessible to people who generally don't have training in data. And her book, for those of you who haven't read Whole Number, Half Truths, please do read that. Thank you, Rukmini, for joining us today. Rajat Sethi. Rajat is a political strategist. Very few people can claim on their Twitter handle that they have been advisors to 2 chief ministers. And Rajat is also, author of a book on Assam. He has closely worked with the Bharatiya Janata Party, and in his capacity as political strategist, he must be looking at a lot of polling data. So thank you, Rajat, for joining us today. And I think this diverse panel, the idea was of someone like an academic, journalist, and person who works with data, and a political strategist will get a ringside view of what is happening in the world of polling and why things are the way they are. So let me start with Rajat, and then I'll go to Rukmini and then Neelanjan. Rajat, my first question, and please feel free to sort of bring in points that you wanted to say. Why do you think at this moment exit polls are getting sort of projections wrong? And are they getting wrong only on TV? Or they are also giving wrong information, wrong in meaning wrong forecast to even people within the parties, right? My guess is that it would be the same, but you might be privy to some more insights.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you so much for inviting me to this important discussion, and with such esteemed panelists as well. If you remember, this idea of discussing this and putting out our concerns around why exit polls are going this wrong happened right in the TV studios. We were together on India Today deliberating what went wrong, because the numbers were changing, and within 30 minutes, we had to completely reverse our assessments of what happened or didn't happen in Haryana. And it was very embarrassing, to say the least. And I can imagine when our videos are cut out and, are trolled later on that, see, this person was analyzing this, these analysts don't know what they're talking about and all of that. But, part of the problem is that we have to unpack the numbers that are there before our screens. We can't defy that. We are not spokespersons of a party, that we live on an optimistic, wishful thinking that, one party or the other party is only going to win. So our job becomes even more difficult. And I think this is why we had this thought process that we need to deliberate this. We need to look at, from a very analytical perspective, what is going wrong, essentially. So since I have dealt with quite a few survey organizations, agencies over the past 1 decade or so, I believe that there are certain secular challenges and there are certain temporal challenges of late that we are experiencing. Some of the permanent challenges that I see among the surveyors in India is, most important is that the statisticians are missing from the survey industry. I can tell you that I have sat through some of these big, and I'm not pinpointing any specific organization at all, but I'm just saying that when you sit with them and you try and understand what is what level of strategies they have gone about in effectively randomizing the data, how have they ensured that various caste and gender parity is ensured in some aspects of randomization, and what have they done to clean up the data, what are what is your statistical sort of solution to houses where you're not able to find your sample to interview. What do you do about that? And a lot of the answers that we get are largely non-scientific in nature, and that sort of starts putting errors into the system. And if at all some surveyor actually goes out about normalizing data, the underrepresented samples and the noise in that gets zoomed out and becomes much bigger. So that is one problem. The other problem also is that the complexity of, first of all, identifying how is the electorate thinking, and then whether that electorate has actually gone out and voted or not. Essentially, that's the most important thing of exit polls. And a lot of exit polls have the live data at 6 p.m. and 6 p.m. is actually the time when the polling stops. So how do you effectively infer that in the first half itself, you are able to see all aspects of an electorate or is actually going out and voting, and you are able to successfully interview them? If there is some kind of a pattern which is underlying in terms of who is going and voting out first and who is going and voting out later in the day, that also is impacting exit polls, and that is perhaps not getting captured at all in our data. Then to some extent, I'm also seeing that the amount of, over a period of time, the amount of money power in elections is only and only increasing. The candidates in the fray of the cross-party line are spending much more money in the last 1 or 2 days, which is also swaying the voting pattern behavior, at least in some pockets. Now, if that happens, the substrate that you're working with, your pre-poll analysis tends to direct in some direction, point in some direction, but these outlier events are happening which you don't exactly know. In a lot of elections, a lot of your viewers would have heard that "Arey paisa niche tak nahi pahuncha," it did not reach the booth level, or they were not able to distribute, or they were able to distribute. So these are like events which you can't really control. And that also tends to impact some of the overall predictions that go in, because these are like complete outlier events. Then I believe that there are more recent problems that we are observing, largely because we are going further and further away from the 2011 census that was done. Now, it's been a really long time. It's been almost 15 years that we do not know what's the population of a district, what's the population of what has been the pattern of migration within that. Electoral rules are there, I agree. Electoral rules are updated as well. What names are getting dropped, what cleaning up is happening, what is the pattern in that, and how is that data that is being updated by the Election Commission, not by the census, incorporating and changing the underlying caste equations in each constituency. It is also very hard if we move away from some base data to cross-check or to sort of use as proxies for predicting the numbers. All of this, and on top of that, groupthink. Especially the exit polls which are coming on television are, in my view, are entering into some kind of a groupthink. They are, since the pressure is so much now, they tend to consult with each other as well, and that are they not way off the mark, or are they very divergent in their opinions and all? They try to shy away कि भाई हम डूबे, सामने वाला भी डूब रहा है, तो डूबने में कोई दिक्कत नहीं है. So that is the thought process which is going in, and that is quite dangerous in my view. And I also, when we look at campaigns, we tend to reach out to 2 or 3 survey agencies, and once the data comes in, largely we get to know that most of these survey agencies have the same set of people at the on the ground
Right.
actually go out and collect and do those surveys, do those interviews. So the pool of the people who are on the ground is the same. There's 2 3 survey agencies who come in and give the data, largely discuss with each other as well, so that nobody is off the mark, and they give a set of idea which is just um, uh, is just the same of what you are hearing from the others as well. So essentially, if the strategy making has garbage in, and the strategy is also built on that data, it's garbage out, right? So it's collectively wrong inputs can actually destroy election strategy making, and it can also destroy the end results, and then it just messes up. So if, so for example, if a survey agency says that, okay, Congress is winning Haryana, right? So
Yeah.
the strategists would actually want to understand, okay, if they are winning, where are they not winning? Let's assume that they are winning in the XYZ seats. Let's not work enough, or let's not do micromanagement over there, because the overall chemistry and the mahal is so good that we don't have to bother. Let's worry about the other seats. But your
Hmm.
data in itself is wrong, and you miss micromanagement on important seats, and you end up losing. So it
Hmm.
perpetuates the cycle that way. So these are some of the suggestions which I sort of feel have entered into the system and have sort of corrupted the system to some extent.
Great. No, thank you, Rajat. I think one important thing which you pointed out is, of course, the organization of these survey agencies itself. They don't have enough people on the ground. Perhaps the statisticians are missing. I don't think polling agencies can do anything about the census data that the government has to take care of. But I think that part is an important problem which you are pointing out. Now, let me turn to Rukmini. Rukmini, I remember you tweeted something after 2024 elections, which was that if vote estimates of these polls are wrong, then how can we study many things that we study, right? Like even this time, most like including myself, I said like there, it seems that, or wrote after the election that it seems that there was a Jat versus non-Jat consolidation. Now, it's just based on an intuition and historical evolution of party system in Haryana. But can we actually make that claim based on some polling data where the estimates were completely off the mark? Like despite that, I've seen in multiple sort of like newspapers and web channels those sort of like vote by caste tables or gender by, like that perhaps many of the schemes that the government announced, Ladli Behna and other thing, brought women voters to the BJP. So my question one is like, is there anything else that you want to add apart from, since you have interacted with many of these polling organizations? What do you think like is not right at the moment, which might be producing these sort of like outcomes? And two, what do like you have any like ways or suggestions on how that data should be used once you are so off the mark on vote estimates as well?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for these questions, Rahul, and thanks very much for having me on this panel as well. I think the point that you led with really cuts to the heart of my worry about what's happening. There is the concern about getting the vote share and the direction wrong, which is a very serious concern. And then there is the concern about analysis based on that. I think, Rajat's done a really good job of explaining the issues with getting the overall direction wrong, or the votes wrong. I think it has an impact on, in the early, if we don't talk about exit polls, in the early stages, it might have an impact on political strategies. It certainly has an impact on media coverage. Those are all things that happen. But I wanted to focus on the exit poll stroke post poll segment a little bit more, and on this issue of analysis after the election. So the thing that worries me the most, and I agree with the sentiment that you began with, that we are not here really to bash polling agencies or praise them excessively, but more to figure out what's going wrong and how can it be made better. And there too, I really would like to draw a distinction between the serious pollsters and then the ones that are frankly shady. And, rather than get into some sort of subjective discussion on that, I think it's useful to think about pollsters who at least share their methodology clearly with anyone who asks for it versus those who don't, including sharing exactly who has commissioned the poll. And I think there should be a broad consensus among analysts, including in the media and others, that continuing to deal or take, in any way give any airtime to pollsters who fall in the latter category is truly damaging. And in a way, they sort of pad up the group that Rajat described, where, the group that comes together to say, let's all sort of broadly agree with each other. I know they call each other the day before to make sure, nobody's very off. So at least let's get those bad apples out of that, let's draw some bars of quality there. So among the ones who are doing this serious work, I can imagine things go wrong. Things have gone wrong in major elections across the world. But the big concern to me is the lack of transparency around the adjustments that are made following an exit poll that has gone wrong, in the gap between it going wrong and these analyses appearing in newspapers. I would like to say that I would like to hope that there is, scientific and sort of statistically solid work that goes into the adjustments that are then made to the vote share. However, that happens in the darkness. None of us are privy to those specific adjustments. And some of it seems to fall into voodoo mathematics category to me. I mean, one of the, again, just I feel like maybe we've not demanded enough quality. So, for example, we get margins of error broadly. But when you're talking about a very small subsample, when you are about 1 women in UP, for example, the margins of error for those subsamples is so large, and nobody is putting out tables with plus minus 16% as the margin of error could well be for such small subsamples. So then what are the adjustments you are making on those minute subsamples to still put out these confident tables the day after is happening in the darkness, and does not seem to me to be something that can even happen in a very solid or sort of believable fashion. So then, given all of this, for those using this data to form analyses about the country, to go about business as usual is also something that I find worrisome. So just as we feel like, hey, listen, let's pause about what's happening with exit polls, let's do a rethink before we. Similarly, I feel, why have we not taken a second to pause on analysis before going right ahead with it? So one of the things I did, in fact, after 2024, is I just did not read those caste-wise and gender-wise analyses, because subconsciously it takes hold on your mind, and then this becomes a narrative that just becomes fact based on now what we know our opinion polls, exit polls that got it wrong. Things like women voters choose this, Muslims chose not to do that, and then it becomes very hard to shake those beliefs once they've taken hold. So I very consciously do not read them now. I think until we feel more confident about the underlying data for reasons because of getting a look under the hood, or because of methods improving, I think these narratives taking hold is a very damaging thing to happen. In terms of ways about things getting better, I could maybe talk a little bit more in the next round, but one of the things I've done is, just out of curiosity, looked a little bit at exit polls in the UK and the US. And one thing that happens, for example, now in both the UK and US, it is a consortium of media that comes together with one agency, Ipsos in the UK and Edison Research in the US, to do this joint exit poll. Now, of course, this isn't to say this is ideal. Multiple exit polls by good pollsters can also be, a promising thing. So I don't think a consortium is the only answer. However, both of these consortiums have on them exactly what Rajat was describing as being missing, which is a solid statistician. These are national figures The two key statisticians in the UK exit polls are recognizable figures on TV because they have built this expertise over the last decades. That's one point. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the specifics of how the UK and US do their exit polls, maybe in the next round of things. The second thing is to take these mistakes seriously and not convert them into memes of someone celebrating or dancing or laughing, and the way we are behaving about it right now. So in the UK, in 2015, when the exit poll went significantly wrong, there was a House of Commons inquiry into it. And again, it wasn't like you are gaming the stock market, so we are going to find ways to go after you. That wasn't the idea. The idea was that we have been able to rely, and you have been extremely accurate for years and decades. There is a system, what has gone wrong? And the report makes for excellent reading as well. It gives, great insight into what happened. And I would say the rough summary is that there was unrepresentativeness in the exit polling sample. I'd be happy to talk about the specifics in the next round. But when things go wrong, I wish the inquiry into it could be a little more serious.
Thoughtful. Yes.
Yeah, a little more thoughtful, serious, and a little less gleeful even, even some of us on the outside, it's easy to take these pot shots, but for a democracy, if we're interested in these things getting better, then we need to think about more constructive ways to go about that as well.
No, thank you for pointing that out, Rukmini. In fact, it seems once exit polls go wrong, pollsters become the scapegoat of this sort of entire exercise, where the burden has to be shared by at least media houses as well as perhaps academia, not of those pollsters per se. But I think what seems to be happening is that in UK, US, you have polling councils, right? And polling agencies have created this regulatory council. One, we don't have this regulatory council. I'm not asking government to step in, but some peer review kind of a thing, which can only happen when what I've heard that exit poll or polling is very costly exercise. If you don't put in resources, then as Rajat said, garbage in, garbage out kind of a thing. Most of the New York Times or ask of any sort of reputed newspapers or channels, they all have polling director position, meaning that in the media house there is someone who understands statistics and data to interact with polling. And then I think something which is maybe changing a little bit now, but most of our political science department across the country, I don't think at MA level teaches sort of polling and survey research. And so there is sort of very few people who in a common sort of common sense language understand how polling is being done or those kind of things. No, thank you for pointing that out. Neelan, since I know you have some slides to share, you have the sort of requisite to upload your slide. Hopefully, as Rukmini said, it's not voodoo maths. Just kidding.
Oh, voodoo maths. Let me just quickly see. You can all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So on survey research, for those of you who want to do more, should take a class with either Rahul or me at some point. We do, I think, hopefully push people in the right direction. So given all the people on the panel who actually, in some sense, are much more engaged with using either for strategy or interpretation, I thought what I would do is sort of be a bit more of the straight academic and talk about on a technical level why some of our polls are going wrong, increasingly so. And I think many of the suggestions I have are very similar to both what Rajat and Rukmini said, but sort of reiterate why those things matter even from a technical standpoint. So I thought what I would do here is actually give a bit of a stylized world for us to sort of make sense of why things are starting to go wrong. Okay. Obviously, the world of voters, along gender, religion, caste, you name it, is extremely complicated. What I wanted to show you is that even in a very simple, stylized, hypothetical population, the kind of sampling that even our best pollsters are doing today is actually leading to some pretty severe biases. And actually, these are things that if you had a professional statistician or people who were working with things, these are things that actually are being addressed to a much more significant degree in other contexts. So some of the challenges we're facing are actually quite technical. So in this stylized model, what I have is two caste groups, A and B, a population of 12 people, okay? And each caste group has 6 people in this population, right? So it's 50-50, caste group A and B. Okay? Now, what is important for this analysis is that when you survey, you have people who have different kinds of disposition. Right? You have people who are very responsive. They will immediately give consent. They might even seek out the surveyor, right? They're easy to locate. They'll always answer. Then you have people who are hesitant, right? You might have to search for them a little bit. They might be somewhere deep in a slum. It might be hard to get consent. They might be a little bit concerned, but they will give you consent and they'll answer. And the third group are people who are genuinely not going to respond. They simply won't respond to anyone who comes asking for it. Okay? And I want to sort of work with just the stylized world and get a sense of how biases happen. Now, what you'll notice here is that among the responsive population in this example, everybody is voting for BJP. Among the hesitant population, it is about 50-50 for BJP. And among the non-responsive population, in this example, the majority are voting for Congress. And so if you take just the proportion, the true percentage of people voting for BJP is 58%. Among caste group A, it's 67%, and among caste group B, it is 2%. Now, the non-responsive people will never answer, right? So traditional non-response bias will tell you the best possible you can get is either hesitant or responsive people, which will give you 75% of the population voting for BJP, 80% of A and 67% of B. What I'm going to show is that even if we restrict ourselves to the population that you can get, the sampling that we're typically using in India is problematic. I'm going to give a stylized example where you have to pick 6 people. Okay. So the first set of methods, so this is by Axis and some of the biggest pollsters, right? Use something called an exit poll, which is actually a form of quota sampling. What they will say is that we know that 50% of the population is A and 50% of the population is B. What we're going to do then is if you have to select 6 people, we'll select exactly 3A and 3B. Now the surveyors will go into the field, try to get people as they're coming out of the polling booth, and they'll try to fill exactly 3A and 3B. Now the problem is that more responsive people are going to be easier for these people to target. You can see that there are already 3A people among the responsive population, right? So they're just going to come and respond. Among the B population, there's 1 responsive person, but there's 2 hesitant people. So they'll fight through and find these hesitant people. So among the A population, they would assume 100% of A is voting for BJP, when actually 80% of the population you can get is voting for BJP, and actually a much lower percent. B, they're going to get right. They're going to assume, therefore, that you get 83% vote share for the BJP, when actually the best they could have was 75%. Okay? The implication here is that because you're doing quota sampling, you're picking up the most responsive people with the caste group. If one particular caste group is very responsive, you're going to miss estimating on that caste group quite badly. The second method is what CSDS Lokniti typically does. What they'll do is they'll go to a polling booth and say, okay, here are 40 names randomly chosen, get 25 of them, okay? So similarly, let's assume this is a randomly drawn list. You say, get the first 6 you can, okay? So what you can do, and this is, you have to calculate the expectation, so more complicated. You'll see that 92% of, they'll estimate on average that A, 92% has, BJP has 92% vote share and B has 78%. Okay. Here, what's happening as compared to this is that because they had to fill the quota, they went and filled out the hesitant B people. Here, because you're simply getting the people who are going to respond, that pressure to find responsive people and the fact that responsive people respond first is going to actually create a higher bias. So here, actually, this number is wrong. It should be 85% vote for the BJP. Okay? So you can see that even if we're we were trying to get our best possible scenario, both of these sort of scenarios would actually give us very, very bad estimates. And the reason is we're not thinking about how to reach the hesitant population. One way to think about why the polls are starting to go off to a much greater extent is that you simply are getting more and more hesitant populations with more political consultants, more surveys, more media on the ground. And just very quickly, what I would say is that, yes, there is non-response, but in my experience, non-response is not as bad as you think. It happens in very violent places like West Bengal, maybe increasingly in UP. There's very little evidence that we have that Indians are systematically non-responsive, right? So don't blame voters. We should be blaming ourselves first. Second, I think I don't want to go over it again, hire statisticians, report the data. Third, I want to take a very strong stand on this. We're talking about, exactly what Rukmini did. I don't trust any of the subpopulation data anymore. You're getting these kinds of biases in subpopulations because of response rates, and you're getting high margins of error. Increasingly, even in Rahul's work, my own work, you see it in newspapers, we're just simply using election commission data. We've started to move away from the survey because it's simply untrustworthy. One final thing that I would say, as I sort of close up here, is that, a lot of the data is being presented after it's being adjusted. And Rukmini mentioned this, right? People are doing some kind of weighting, some kind of adjustment. They're not telling you what it is. The reality is that weighting data in and of itself is an incredibly complicated and sophisticated academic subject that we still have huge debates about. If you are not clear about exactly how you are weighting data, I would much rather have the data presented unweighted so that I can at least work with that and think about how to address the biases. Once you give me weighted data, I have no idea what the data gave me and what you gave me. And that basically makes the data almost unusable, especially when you're off the mark. So I'll just leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Neelan. That was very helpful. Just to, like in a sort of like non-statistical language, the weighting data is not tampering with the data, right? Like you do have to apply weights, especially not just on the sort of like unrepresentative part of the sample, but certain things are going to be recorded lower or lesser in surveys, right? For example, when you are doing a survey, smaller parties and independents tend to get omitted in the surveys or they won't pick up that data. So you do need to weigh that up. So weighing has a procedure, but what Neelan is suggesting that unless we know how that procedure was applied, it's sort of like a problematic data to begin with.
Yeah, and just very quickly on that, to see just what can go wrong. Let's assume you've under-yielded on women, and the women that you picked up who were responded to were systematically saying BJP at a higher rate than the population. If you then say, well, I've undersampled women, I'm going to weight it up, you're actually going to exacerbate a bias. You're not going to move closer towards the correct answer. So unless we know that you're doing these things, it's very hard for us to know where the biases have come from.
Okay. Thank you, Neelan. Let me ask everyone who's listening here, if you have questions, please put on the Q&A box and I will start weaving them when I present them to my panelists. So please keep asking your questions on Q&A box, and panelists can also respond to some of those questions by typing the answers. Rukmini, let me ask you sort of like complete your thought on what did we learn from the UK sort of like fiasco, like, is it possible to have something like that in India, or we are, business as usual, पिछली बार गलत हुआ था, फिर election आएगा, फिर तमाशा होगा, मतलब, are we even serious about it? Because we go extremes, right? We like the first thing is these are sort of like useless exercise, they should be banned. Rather than like, or they are all sort of like crooks and which I don't understand. Logically, it doesn't make sense. But yeah.
So is it likely to happen part? I have to say that very rarely does the Indian media or parts of the Indian media come together on something. So the anticipation of a group of media houses coming together to do something like this is not something I see easily. I wonder if the direction needs to come from somewhere else, if the attempt to convene can come from either a university or even a polling agency, with the promise though that then the raw data is made available. So just to speak to Neelan's point about it, from what I've read about how things go down on election night in either the UK and particularly in the UK, because it's the description of it is all that more dramatic, that they're practically in a bunker, and an actually underground was the description I read of it. But there are representatives of all the major broadcasters, their own statisticians and in-house experts, as well as Ipsos in the UK example. And then the data is coming in from their exit polls at exit pollsters at the different locations. And then they're going over it, and there is this pre-decided statistical methodology that has been perfected over time to put out the final results. So I don't know if that raw data is then further made available to others, but at the very least, the group that is sitting together there does get to see it, someone beyond the agency alone. And just to talk a little bit about the specifics of the two, and think about whether there are lessons for us here. In the UK, it is a single question exit poll. Who did you vote for? That's it. So the attempt to do all of this racial, gender, all of that does not happen at that stage. That certainly happens in other bigger surveys, but the exit poll is a single question, with the acknowledgement that this is, a hard thing to do, particularly at the polling station. And in some ways, the UK is closer to how we can think about it, because the bulk of voting happens on election day, as it does over here. While in the UK now, a huge percentage are now mail-in or early voters, and election day itself is, I think, down to in the 40% range. So it is a single question. And the enumerators, the polling sample, are the same ones that they revisit every year. So there is a historical trend that they can go back to. And so changes in that trend become very telling and are then extrapolated to other similar regions. Now, I have to say, and Neelan would know this better, you and Neelan would both know this better, I don't know if this sort of extrapolation to other constituencies or regions is at all possible in India, given the heterogeneity. So that may, the historical, going back to the same constituencies and not randomly resampling every time as ours do, I'm sure cuts down costs, allows you to have this panel, and helps outcomes in the UK exit polls, but I don't know if that's replicable.
The panel is always more costly.
I see,
panels
because
are costly.
but if you're going to the same polling station, you're not having to find someone's house in a village or something. That should be
There is
relatively.
always a lot of dropouts. So if I create a sample of 100 people this time, next my probability of reaching to those same 100 is sort of like lesser than doing a fresh sample. So
No,
that's
the unchanging element is the booth, not the people. You are going to the same booth with the assumption that roughly the same demographics, and not assumption, if demographics change, you incorporate them with fresh census data, as Rajat mentioned. But the unchanging factor here is the booth. You keep going back to the same booth, you measure how that booth has voted over time, and then you see if those are changes that can be extrapolated. So that's one thing to think about. In the US, and it's a big question. It is 20 questions. It's your race, your gender, all of that is asked. But in both in the UK, you simulate a ballot box. So there is a actual ballot box carried by the pollster, and you put your vote into it. So there is no oral stating of who you voted for. Even in the UK, which is a less where saying who you voted for presumably is less stressful than it is in India. And in the US, it is a pen and pencil thing. You don't write your name, but you fill out all of these questions on the paper yourself. You're not answering the questions to the enumerator there at the exit poll booth. Now that poses its own challenges, though, of course, I think we have to rethink how much of those challenges it poses, given the significant increase in literacy as well as a fair amount of digital adoption. So there is a way to think about this being possible as well. But these are very clearly exit polls conducted at the polling booth themselves. So, and just the final point in this, which sort of ties in both what both Rajat's point about the census as well as Neelan's point about responsive, non-responsive voters, which is when the UK conducted this inquiry, the sum total of it was the sense that the polling sample adjustments were being made on the population, on the demographics of the population, while the voter population was systematically different from the overall population in some important ways, including that more politically engaged people were more likely to turn out to vote. They ended up being younger and voting in a particular way. So I too agree, of course, that we need better population-wide demographic data, but perhaps we need to be able to understand the voting population better. Now, this means almost like a two-level survey, right? You need to understand the base population that's come out that day to vote, as well as the sample that you are speaking to. It doesn't sound easy or cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there is a significant point to think of here about in terms of how voters differ from the overall population. Does it mean that there are fewer migrants? Does it skew richer? We don't know any of these things. And of course, just a final point, even then narratives take hold. So I saw even when the Election Commission held this press conference putting out the dates about Jharkhand and Maharashtra, they presented urban versus rural voter population voter turnout charts, and the text in it is urban apathy, the rich don't care, something like that.
Yeah.
While so many micro studies that we've seen point much more to address proof, migration, these being much bigger issues, getting the day off, bigger issues than taking a holiday to Mathiran or Himachal, as many of our newspapers like to imagine, is what's really, driving down voter turnout.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of those claims are not based on data, but what members of our bureaucracy think might be happening. Rajat, if I can ask you, so, I think while you were sort of like making your points, let's sort of like divide the problem of pre-poll or opinion poll surveys versus exit polls, right? So pre-poll surveys telling you something and it doesn't happen at the outcome, I can understand because those polls took place 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a month in advance. So for political strategists, actually pre-poll surveys are much more important. Of course, exit polls are also important to think about next time strategy, but you are like thinking in time, right? Like what should be done within the month to be able to change what those pre-poll surveys are saying. The problem is that exit polls can be tested against some base, which is that, okay, whether they got it wrong or right, right? Pre-polls is all we can basically like put our faith in God kind of a thing, that because you can only find out after the fact. And after the fact, so for Neelan and I, doesn't matter. We can keep doing our analysis for months, but for you, you lost a state by that time. So so one strategy could be that political parties can basically take multiple sort of like survey data points and sort of like each one of them might be getting a very different kind of estimates, but you just sort of like minimize your risk by looking at more data points. So what I want to understand from you, like, do you think the same kind of like, of course, the organization part is the same thing of survey agencies, but like what I'm asking literally is most of the explanations that are given why exit polls went wrong doesn't sort of like work for me because everything happened after the fact. Like people had voted, then you were polling, right? For example, if you ask people why UP poll went wrong, they have all the theory of basically like two sort of stalwarts of BJP fighting among each other and cutting their vote. But you were polling the voter after the person has voted. So, like, what in your opinion is happening? Like the sort of like the difference between pre-poll and exit polls.
I think these are two absolutely different beasts, and they have to be tamed in different ways. The constraints are different in both these, the exit polls and the opinion polls. In exit poll, time is of paucity, if not the resource. On the opinion polls, you still have time. So that sort of, allows you a major difference in tackling the issues that opinion polls and exit polls throw. what we try and do is, we have a much more bigger sample size, so that we, get rid of some of the errors which are creeping in because of unrepresentative samples. To some extent, of course, I mean, not to the level that you would expect a scientific method would suggest, but the sample size is higher. It's always a moving graph, right? I mean, you do at least 3 to 4 rounds of opinion polls in the run up to the election. You see which way momentum is. Your aspect is not about a win or a lose. You keep getting these, time-stamped data points which are coming in, so that you understand the momentum. Is it shifting or not? Is your campaign building up or not? Is it exciting the voter or not? Is it going past the tipping point wherein it is becoming a very head-on-head election, a really tight election? Or is it something that, no matter what you do, this seat, you're not going to win because of these many factors? If you don't win, what do you do? What is the strategy? How do you make the other lose instead of you winning? So that is like dividing and splitting the votes and ensuring more people as independents are brought in. You then pick and choose which casting community doesn't have a representative candidate. How do you put them up and cut whose vote? Those are the questions that you sort of grapple with in opinion polls. Not the true picture. It's like a strategy, a dynamic strategy in making. Of course, there are problems. The problems around all these errors creeping in, and biases creeping in and messing up with the outcome. But we tend to play with raw data a lot. We don't allow most of the survey agencies to put their own mind into it and mess up on the weights and everything that you were talking about. We just don't do that. We have our own, over a period of time, experience built in. You understand, these momentum aspects are, there is no measurement of it, but you understand the excitement. We don't ask leading questions. If you leave the survey agencies to decide on the questions, I believe that barring a few very, very professional ones, a lot of them point to a lot of leading questions. And that also messes up, and voters are smart. They tend to, read through, and a lot of these days, as I think Neelan was also mentioning, that because of not just strategists, just the sheer pressure that a politician goes in, because there is so much of financial resources at stake. He really wants to be sure that if he's winning or not. They tend to put in a lot of money into surveys and assessments all through the election cycle. So that chai wala corner is replete with surveyors, same set of surveyors, by the way, coming over and over and over again, asking the same set of questions. So a voter who might be hesitant at one point in time becomes more pronounced, say, in the second, third survey, and might not even want to speak. Why have you again come in and started speaking to me? So especially in assembly elections, when you have a very small, constituency, a rural constituency, and most of these random samples, you go out and you start fetching, where is my sample? It could be household. The person is missing from the house. You say that, okay, this person is there. If he's sitting in a group of 3-4, their bravado sort of dominates his rational thinking. There are all kinds of issues that come in. So I'm of a view that opinion polls, the good thing is, you don't need a definitive answer from it. So you pick signals from it and draw your strategy making out of those broad signals that you can get. And that's it.
Okay.
And you don't worry about the end result. Part of it is like, you need to ensure that the D-Day, you're able to draw in your voters as well. One of the biggest tasks is all your micromanagement on one side. On that D-Day, how is the polling happening? What's the polling behavior? What booths are, hyperactive? Where the polling is artificially slow? Where is it artificially high? All of these aspects become that D-Day management, which can sway the results one way or the other.
And we also, with exit polls, I think one problem that might be also playing a role is that we don't know we don't know about the turnout, especially at the constituency level on that day. And we don't know about the turnout of the groups. And so if you don't have that kind of information, then sort of like making, if groups turned out very differently, then it's going to create a problem in the estimates that are being produced. In fact, like, we don't know the turnout at constituency level many days after, right? Like,
Absolutely.
That's
And
another
you need to
problem.
predict it at, say, 1 p.m., 12 p.m. or 1 p.m. You need to, you can't, extend. Otherwise, where is the computational time? You need to compute all that data, put it into models, and then predict a number on the vote share. It's very hard. Not just the vote share, you have to also go out and predict the seats. That requires at least 3 to 4 hours of processing, no matter how much experience you are. And the window, therefore, you just don't know how much is the polling going to be.
Neelan, let me bring you in, and I'll just again request people in audience, if you have questions, please put it on Q&A box, and we'll try answering some of them. One question is on Sri Lanka, and we'll take that later. So 2 points. One, something which you said in your sort of like presentation, which is very interesting, about this category of hesitant voter or non-responsive voter, which in sort of like common lingo is silent voters, right? Silent voters messing up the polls. What you actually hinted as that in last few years, because there is sort of like lots of survey taking place on the ground, lots of strategies being there, that's sort of like maybe leading to people becoming more hesitant. Given this problem, is there a way pollsters can sort of like identify how to sample non-hesitant vote, how to sort of like oversample non-hesitant voter and undersample sort of like more responsive voters, so that you can sort of like balance it. When I'm using oversample, undersample, just to balance things, not to sort of like mess up the time. Is there any way we can identify these set of population while doing our surveys?
So 2 things, right?
Sorry,
I mean,
and
I think,
Rahul, if you don't mind, Neelan, I'm going to add a question to that, my own, which is, I hear people sometimes ask me, I don't know the answer to it, which is, don't you feel that people are more scared now to respond to surveys? It seems like a very polarized time. There seem like real costs to saying who you vote for. There are some contexts where this may be even more so the case. So when we talk about hesitant responders, do we feel that that might be growing in some contexts at least?
So I think 3 points that I can make. So one, I think that's been discussed in some way. So in the West, actually, they make a distinction between polls of registered voters and polls of likely voters. And so they almost every system, and just to be very clear, the magnitudes we're talking about, in the UK and the US, the polls do miss, but they miss by like a percentage point or 2, right? We're talking about much larger misses in the context of India. And most of the polls that we're talking about typically are pre-polls, right? So someone like Nate Silver is not analyzing exit polls, he's analyzing polls up to the day of the vote, right? Which we can't do in individual model code of conduct, but that's sort of so even before the election, you have a certain level of prediction. So I do think that one way of correcting some of these biases is to actually have a good sense of what a likely voter model is. I don't think that there's been any serious work there, but that's the second thing. And this is something, Rahul, we run surveys together, not too far from each other. There's a lot of modern research on how you should do resampling. And there's a lot of modern research about what kind of statistical corrections you can be doing, right? And to be very transparent. None of that is being employed. The methods I talked about today could have come out of the 1960s. And the reality is that our methods on surveying and adjusting surveys have significantly expanded. So I do think that the most obvious thing you can do about hesitant voters, right, is that if we believe that there is some spatial relationship, right? So in this neighborhood, in this village, people are much more likely to be hesitant. Your resampling should somehow try to get a nearby household, right? If you are telling somebody that you just simply need to get 3 of category A and 3 of category B, then that is not happening. If I'm just simply saying you have to get 25 out of 40, then that correction is not happening.
Hmm,
As
hmm,
this hesitation grows, the bias from each of these methods is also going to grow quite significantly,
hmm,
right? So the final point I would make is, what Rukmini said, that, is how do we think about hesitation, where it is growing? So the one place, I'm just gonna be very open, I think everybody knows that the one place where hesitation is growing massively and explains what happened in 2024 is UP. Anybody who's been doing fieldwork in UP over the last 10 to 15 years has seen the change, right? There's no doubt, right? I mean, there's no, it is a nightmare. UP has started to feel a lot like West Bengal in terms of polling and talking to people and so on and so forth, right? The police are very, very strong in both contexts, and they don't know who you are. They don't know which party you're with. Right? I do, however, feel that barring those kinds of extreme contexts, so maybe Assam, West Bengal, UP, Tripura, I can think of a couple of states, right? I do think that voters might be hesitant, but they do respond, right? I don't think that you have pure non-response voters in most places. And therefore, there are strategies. I mean, this, and there are people who were running surveys at election time last time who were able to get the vote percentages pretty close to correct. Okay, and that tells you that there are, if you do your sampling in a scientific manner, you can still get pretty close to the right answer in India in most places. So I don't think those methods are being used. I do think thinking about likely voters, I do thinking hard about statistical readjustment and resampling is very, very needed, but even by the top pollsters. And I do think it would actually significantly increase the quality of these polls.
Okay, thanks, Neelan, for this insight. Again, I'll remind, if people have questions, just please put them on. Let me sort of like ask Rajat using two questions here. Rajat, do you think exit polls serve any purpose? Should they be there, especially since there are two questions related to that? And the reason I'm also sort of like putting this question to you, because when we just like met today, you said, like we need to have this conversation a little bit more seriously, because a large number of people seems to be losing faith in this sort of like art, science, or whatever we want to call it. So what would be your answer to those who think that exit polls don't serve any purpose?
See, all kinds of polls are mirrors to the society. There is larger sociological purpose that you serve if you know the society better. So I'm firmly of the view that exit polls at least give you one perspective of how the politics is shaping, and what is the statistical understanding of the electorate and of the population at large. You kind of look into questions around not just caste dynamics, but what is motivating people to vote or pick to have a preferential voting in favor of which party. What were the motivators for it? How are various age groups reacting to the political options that they have? Also, how is the gender behavior? A lot of policy making can go into based on having that a piece of data, because just through the polling data you cannot have an understanding around what are those fine lines around which a political party or the political party which is about to come into power, there will be policy questions, governance questions, and they would want to tackle all of that, and try and see that in their overall report card they might be winning, but these are the sections of voters who perhaps are not happy with you. You need to course correct. You need to make a special outreach to those segments of the society as well. So I believe purely dishing it away that it doesn't serve any social purpose is myopic in my view. I think it serves serious purpose provided the data is reliable. And I think the angst that the public has against these exit polls is stemming because it's not reflecting the true picture. But does it not serve purpose? I don't agree with that. It serves huge purpose.
Thanks, Rajat. Neelan, though I know the answer to this, but it's better if you say this, which is a lot of people, especially pollsters on TV, not commentators, as Mohit's question is, that even at the same vote share, they arrive at very different seat share. And they say because they used very different statistical models, or if not models, assumptions were used very differently. So I want you to answer the statistical part, forecasting is not that hard. But do you actually think that all the time when seat projections are happening, there is you don't need statistical models, especially if you are polling in every seat, then you can just do a rough count. So some people might actually be doing rough count. You see a lot of journalists or just travelers making predictions that I think this party is going to win 35 seats. That's just a rough estimate. So not every time a pollster announces a seat is based on statistical models. But Neelan, can you talk a little bit more on assumptions within the statistical models which may lead to different seat predictions?
So I think one way to think about it is there are actually two classes of surveys that are being done, right? So one is something where it's a random sample across a state, let's say, and based on that and the method that is being used by the pollster, they're trying to estimate the number of seats. In other words, there's no guarantee that every seat has been surveyed or a sufficient number of people have been surveyed in every seat. Another type of poll, which was popularized by Axis, is you go and you draw a fairly large sample size in every seat. Now, the benefit of the latter, beyond, I mean, it's very expensive, is that you have such a big sample in every seat that, you know, all you have to do, as you say, is just simply count, do a rough count and be able to predict the seats. So often what is happening in an Axis type approach is that you're getting a very, very biased type of sampling, quota sampling. If the gap is if the gap is reasonably large, as has happened in many of the national elections, 2014, 2019, those biases aren't going to fundamentally change your prediction of who's going to win that seat or not. So your seat predictions are going to be great, right? If elections start getting closer, those biases really start coming into play, right? And you know, I think unfortunately for Axis, and recently, you know, I happened to do a show with, you know, they were banished from the show that you did, and then they ended up on the show that I did, and I'm not sure that they, you know, anyway. But you know, I think this is the thing that they're falling afoul of, and you know, you can see the problem there. The other problem is also clear, right? If you have some random formula, there's no reason why the formula has to be true. Right? There are all kinds of reasons why the exact same vote shares at the, you know, on average might yield completely different seats. We just saw that in Haryana, right? Two parties or two coalitions with almost the exact same average vote share, but yet a dramatic victory for the BJP, right? I mean, so we know that just simply estimating average vote share is going to be very hard to predict seats from. And so pollsters don't declare it. They don't declare how they do it. And you should be fairly suspicious of declarations of seat shares from vote shares.
Rukmini, one last question from you, and then one question from Rajat, unless anyone wants to sort of like add anything. As sort of like a founder and director of a platform, you know, which is going to tell stories through data, what are a couple of expectations like you have from pollsters, not in terms of like they should have a statistician, those things are important, but that they should be telling us at least 5, 6, 7 things before they make any projections. So transparency, sample representativeness, those are the things. But other than that, what is there anything else that you have in mind?
So who commissioned it is my number one question always.
Yes.
And even when I was in the media, I think this was a one that regularly polling agencies would say that they cannot tell us. And again, I really feel like this is where either the media or other analysts using it need to come together to set some bars, where if you're not able to say who commissioned it, then there's very good reason to not use it, in my opinion. So that's one. Then
more of the
margins.
credible pollsters, Rukmini, would say that this has been commissioned by this XYZ channel, right? Unless you are saying that as a pollster, say if I'm a pollster and I'm doing an exit poll for channel A, you want transparency, whether like other than exit polls, was I polling for party B, C, D? Is that what you want to know, or this
No,
particular exit poll?
there is a leading polling agency that was regularly cited on TV who would not tell us who had commissioned the poll.
Okay.
This absolutely happens for numbers
Okay.
that are then used by everyone.
Hmm.
So it seems like a very basic thing to ask for, but we have been not given this information often. And
Hmm.
as you know, these are expensive to conduct. So someone
Hmm.
paid for it, but we are using the data without knowing who paid for it.
Hmm.
So that's one. Then, of course, I think a lot of these are ones that I think you both said that we don't currently get, which is unfortunately, I feel like a lot of polling agencies now feel that saying sample size and saying representative, just put it as nationally representative, and
Yeah.
margin of error plus minus some 3%, 4%, something that sounds kosher,
Yeah.
is it full stop.
Ah.
But representative of what?
Hmm.
Based on what
Right.
is first of all what we don't know. And then secondly, I think now I certainly feel that margin of error by subsample is something that needs declaration. I have not seen it at all, and we certainly need it. I think when you start seeing them in the double digits, as they most certainly will be, if they're being declared honestly, then even a regular reader seeing someone has got 5%, someone has got 6%, and you see plus minus 16% in brackets, they're surely going to think differently about it. And then lastly, one of the things again towards a culture of treating opinion polling more seriously and the results more seriously as well. And Neelan briefly mentioned, the Nate Silver panel sort of approach, which is not to exit polls, but to opinion polls earlier in the process. Now, part of the adjustments that someone like Nate Silver or someone modeling on top of existing opinion polls is able to do is things like historical track record of that particular pollster, likelihood of getting it wrong in a particular direction systematically. They're able to say things like this pollster skews Democrat by plus minus 3%.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're able to bring those levels of things like margins of errors to the polls themselves. So perhaps if at least the ones that are halfway serious, we are able to treat again with halfway seriousness and track them systematically in this manner, then instead of doing, what is done when there's poll of polls right now is
Oh,
straight
that's
up
a great point.
average, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You take them all and divide by the denominator. Instead, if a poll of polls meant some sort of, modeling based on these adjustments, based on their track records too, then at least we can come somewhere towards treating them a bit more seriously and treating this like a little less like, spectator sport.
So straight away, polls of polls is a horrible thing. You shouldn't sort of like.
Horrible thing, which as a junior journalist, I have done several times in my own, for my own employers. So I'll freely admit to it.
Yeah. So last question, Rajat, which is Professor Desai has asked this question, and then Partha has added a list of questions for you, which you can answer at your own pace and will, which is in some ways, political parties may want to use opinion polls, not exit polls, to influence voters. Do you think this is a common practice, or it's hard to do something like that? Because, like you could create mahal, though we know if elections were happening according to opinion polls, then the results were always in favor of opinion polls and exit polls. So, but what would be your take on that? And yeah.
Before I answer this question, I just wanted to add one more thing on your previous question, that what should pollsters, do?
Yes, please.
If their data goes wrong, and with that amount of error margins and all, they should put out the raw data in public domain so that the researchers can actually, look at it, understand where potentially the errors crept in. That way, it's good for them as well. I mean, instead of being the target of everybody throwing darts at them, it is better to say, okay, this was my data. I modeled it in my way. Why don't you guys model it and see if my raw data was wrong, or my sampling itself was problematic, or my models are problematic. That way, the whole industry sort of moves forward. This way, the mess that happened in, say, 2024 Lok Sabha elections and thereafter in Haryana elections is just like a black box. It just happened, and you move on, and then you have a new set of elections. And I'm sure even in Maharashtra, it's an incredibly hard election to predict, Maharashtra election. And you will still see opinion polls and exit polls coming in with that same level of chest thumping that, which goes on with this industry. And this is why having, serious players who are not there for the limelight of it, but are there for the science, for the love of science, the love of statistics, be there. That if that starts dominating, we will see much more humbleness in predicting such a complex democracy like ours. Now, going back to your question around opinion polls, do they sway? Do they have an impact on the momentum and all? Answer is, it is mixed. Clearly, I mean, you can see that this winner takes all was an assumption that a lot of political parties worked with. That that bias that comes into a voter mind, that why should I waste my vote instead of that I would be better off just voting towards the winning party. It is not true at all, and especially we've seen off late people hold on to the reasons that they believe they need to oust a political party or bring in somebody else, be it a negative vote to punish the incumbent or a positive vote to get somebody in. It is less and less getting swayed by this mahal, so to say, that is being built by opinion polls. That has also happened because the trust around mainstream media, which is the vehicle for presenting these opinion polls, has gone substantially down. If there should be, in fact, good surveys to be done around the credibility of most of these media organizations. How worthy are they in people's eyes is going to be reflective of how seriously people will get swayed by opinion polls or not. The answer is, it is reducing number.
Great. Thank you, Rajat. Thank you, Rukmini, and thank you, Neelan. This was a wonderful conversation. I certainly learned a lot, different ways of thinking, what happened in UK, Neelan's three typology of voters. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I hope this was a useful conversation. If you do have some thoughts or questions, you can directly email them, or you can email me and I will forward it to them. But thank you again for joining us today. Take care. Bye-bye.